The Battle of Stalingrad began on the 23rd of August 1942, when units of the German 6th Army reached the Volga River north of the city. The strategic objective was to secure the Volga crossing and deny Soviet access to oil from the Caucasus. The city bore Stalin's name, and its capture held symbolic importance beyond military value. Within weeks, German forces would assault Mamayev Kurgan, a hill in the city center that dominated the entire battlefield. I served as Hauptmann, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 518th Infantry Regiment, part of the 295th Infantry Division, under the LI Army Corps, commanded by General von Seydlitz-Kurzbach. Our division had been fighting in southern Russia since July, advancing through the steppe towards Stalingrad. We had seen action at Rostov and along the Don River bend. The regiment had suffered casualties, but remained combat effective when we received orders to assault the city. We received movement orders on the 8th of September 1942. The battalion assembled at dawn near a Don River crossing 40 kilometers west of Stalingrad. I commanded approximately 800 men, divided into 4 companies. Most were veterans from the Polish and French campaigns of 1939 and 1940. They were experienced soldiers who understood combat. We had received replacements in August after fighting along the Don. These men had never seen battle. The youngest replacement was 17 years old. His name was Schütze Wilhelm Reiner from Bavaria, who had volunteered rather than wait for conscription. The oldest replacement was Obergefreiter Hans Fischer, 36, who had been a physician's assistant in Dresden before the war. My company commanders were experienced officers. Oberleutnant Ernst Dietrich commanded 1st Company. He was 32 years old, from Hamburg, where he had worked as a carpenter before the war. He had fought at Sedan in France and earned the Iron Cross 2nd class. Oberleutnant Peter Koch led 2nd Company. He was 24 and had been a university student in Berlin studying engineering before conscription. 3rd Company was commanded by Hauptmann Klaus Schmidt from Cologne. 4th Company leader was Oberleutnant Heinrich Meyer from Stuttgart. My adjutant was Lieutenant Karl Gottschalk from Munich, an experienced officer who had served since 1939. The march to Stalingrad took 3 days through featureless steppe. The landscape was monotonous and hostile. Flat grasslands stretched to the horizon in every direction. No trees provided shade, no hills broke the endless plain. The heat was oppressive, reaching 38 degrees during midday. The sun beat down relentlessly from a cloudless sky. Men sweated through their uniforms within the first hour of each march. Salt stains marked every piece of clothing. We marched primarily at night to avoid the worst heat and aerial observation. The columns moved in darkness, guided only by the man ahead. Maintaining formation was difficult. Men stumbled over unseen obstacles. The ground was uneven with hidden depressions and sudden rises. Ankle injuries were common. Several men twisted knees or ankles badly enough to require transport in supply wagons. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion regularly, despite marching at night. The residual heat from the day remained oppressive even after sunset. The battalion medic and his assistants treated dozens for dehydration each day. They worked continuously, moving up and down the column, checking men who fell out. Some recovered after rest and water, others required evacuation to rear areas. Water was rationed to half a liter per man per day. It was criminally insufficient given the heat and physical exertion. Men became obsessed with water. They talked about it constantly, dreams of cold rivers and mountain streams. The reality was warm water that tasted of metal from the containers. Half a liter disappeared quickly. Men learned to sip slowly to make it last. Some drank their ration immediately and suffered for hours. Others hoarded it and suffered differently. Discipline regarding water was strict. Guards were posted on water wagons at all times. Men caught stealing water were punished severely. I witnessed one case where a soldier broke into a water wagon during a rest halt. He was court-martialed on the spot and sentenced to carry double equipment load for the remainder of the march. He collapsed on the second day and died of heat stroke. No one expressed sympathy. The physical toll was severe. Men lost weight rapidly despite adequate food rations. The combination of heat, inadequate water, and continuous marching burned calories faster than they could be replaced. Uniforms that had fit properly in Germany now hung loose. Faces became gaunt, eyes sank into skulls. Men began to resemble the skeletons they would soon become. Equipment loads were crushing. Each man carried rifle, ammunition, entrenching tool, gas mask, rations, water bottle, tent section, and personal items. Total weight exceeded 30 kilograms. Strong men managed, weaker men struggled. The youngest replacements suffered most. They lacked the physical conditioning of veterans. Several collapsed completely and had to be evacuated. We saw numerous burned villages during the march. Soviet forces had implemented scorched earth policies across the entire region. Everything of value had been destroyed or removed ahead of our advance. We found no food, no water sources, no shelter that could be used. The destruction was systematic and complete. It demonstrated organizational capability and ruthless determination. The first village we entered had been called Krasnoarmeysk, according to a damaged sign. Perhaps 300 people had lived there before the war. Now it was ash and rubble. Every building had been burned. Not just burned casually, but deliberately and thoroughly. Walls had been knocked down. Wells had been filled with debris. Fields had been salted. Even the cemetery had been desecrated to deny us any shelter among the grave markers. Bodies lay scattered in some villages. Civilians who had not evacuated or could not evacuate. The elderly who moved too slowly. The sick who could not travel. Small children who died during the chaos. Some appeared to have been shot. Bullet wounds were visible. Others died in fires. Their remains were carbonized and twisted. Still others simply lay dead with no visible cause. Starvation, perhaps, or disease, or despair. The Wehrmacht had its own role in these deaths, but we did not discuss it. Orders regarding partisan activity and civilian populations were clear. Reprisals for resistance were standard procedure. Villages suspected of harboring partisans were burned. Civilians found with weapons were shot. Men of military age were often executed preemptively. The justification was military necessity. The reality was murder on a systematic scale. I saw evidence of executions in several villages. Bodies lined up against walls, shell casings scattered on the ground. The positions of the bodies indicated they had been shot where they stood, women and children among them. Old men who could not possibly have been combatants. The executions were recent, days old perhaps. The smell of decomposition was strong but not yet overwhelming. My men walked through these scenes without comment. Veterans had seen similar destruction in Poland and France. They were desensitized to civilian suffering. The replacements were shocked initially but adapted quickly. War erodes moral sensitivity rapidly. What seems horrifying on the first day becomes routine by the third day. By the second week, it is simply background noise. One image remains particularly vivid: a woman and 3 children in a burned house. The woman clutched an infant to her chest. 2 older children lay beside her, all dead. The positioning suggested they died together trying to shelter from flames, or perhaps from bullets. The cause of death was ambiguous. The result was not. I ordered men to move them outside and cover them with debris. It was insufficient gesture, but we did not have time for proper burial. We found no civilians alive in any village along our route. Either they had evacuated successfully or they had been killed. The landscape was a wasteland. Crops burned in fields. Livestock slaughtered or driven away. Farm equipment destroyed. Even trees had been cut down in some areas to deny us firewood. The Soviets were implementing total war. Everything was sacrificed to deny resources to the invader. Soviet artillery harassed us twice during the march. Long-range guns fired from positions we could not see. The shells fell randomly across our route of march, trying to hit columns and supply wagons. On the 10th of September, artillery caught our supply column during daylight movement. 4 trucks were destroyed in the first salvo. 11 men were killed instantly. 23 were wounded, some severely. We continued moving because stopping invited more fire. There was no time to recover bodies properly. They were left where they fell, with identification tags removed. Graves registration would collect them eventually if Soviet forces did not reach them first. On the 11th of September, we saw Stalingrad for the first time. We had reached a ridge 7 kilometers west of the city. The view was extraordinary and terrible simultaneously. Smoke rose from hundreds of fires across the urban landscape. The Luftwaffe had been bombing systematically for 2 weeks. Entire districts had been reduced to rubble. The sky above the city was permanently dark with smoke. Fires burned uncontrolled throughout the ruins. The Volga River gleamed beyond the city like a strip of silver, reflecting sunlight. It was beautiful and horrifying. Our regimental commander, Oberst Heinrich Korfus, assembled all battalion commanders and senior company officers for a briefing that afternoon. He used a tactical map spread across the hood of his command vehicle. He indicated our objective with a ruler, a hill in the center of Stalingrad designated height 102 on German tactical maps. Soviet forces called it Mamayev Kurgan. The name came from Mamay, a Tatar commander whose burial mound supposedly stood there centuries ago. Oberst Korfes explained the tactical significance methodically. The hill rose 102 meters above the surrounding terrain. From its summit, observers had unrestricted views across the entire city and the Volga River beyond. Artillery could be directed accurately onto any target within range. The Volga ferries that brought Soviet reinforcements across the river were visible and could be targeted effectively. The northern factory district could be observed. Soviet supply routes could be interdicted. Capturing Mamayev Kurgan would give us control of the entire battle space. Without it, Soviet forces could observe our every movement and direct devastating artillery fire onto our positions. The hill was the key to Stalingrad. Intelligence indicated the hill was defended by elements of the Soviet 62nd Army under the command of Lieutenant General Vasily Chuikov. Estimated defending strength was between 2 and 4 rifle divisions, though exact numbers were unknown. The hill had been fortified with trenches, bunkers, barbed wire, and extensive minefields. Soviet engineers had worked for weeks preparing defensive positions. Machine gun positions covered all approaches. Artillery had been pre-registered on likely assault routes. The Soviets understood the hill's importance as well as we did. They would defend it with everything available. Oberst Korfes told us the division would attack on the 13th of September. 3 regiments would assault simultaneously from different directions to divide Soviet defensive fire. Our regiment, the 518th, would attack from the west along the main approach. The 516th Regiment would attack from the southwest. The 517th Regiment would provide supporting fire and reserves. Artillery preparation would begin at 0500 hours. The assault would commence at 0530 hours. Luftwaffe support had been promised but could not be guaranteed given air superiority challenges. We would have to take the hill primarily with infantry, supported by assault guns and artillery. The orders were clear, but the intelligence was inadequate. We did not know precise defending strength. We did not know the exact locations of Soviet positions. We did not know where mines had been laid. We did not know where Soviet artillery observation posts were positioned. We would discover all of this during the assault at the cost of many lives. This was standard for offensive operations. Intelligence was always incomplete. Men died filling the gaps in knowledge. We spent the night of the 12th in a ruined factory on Stalingrad's western edge. The building had been a textile mill before the war, British machinery stood rusted and destroyed throughout the structure. The roof had collapsed. Walls were pocked with shell holes and blast damage. We occupied the ground floor, where some protection remained from artillery and aerial observation. Men prepared equipment and tried to rest. Few slept well. The knowledge of what was coming prevented real rest. I walked among the company positions that night, speaking with each commander individually. This was habit and duty both. Commanders needed to know their officers were confident and prepared. Dietrich was confident his men were ready. He had trained them well during the previous months. Koch was more nervous. His education made him analytical. He understood what we faced tomorrow with clarity that others lacked. Schmidt joked constantly, as was his nature. Humor kept fear manageable for him and his men. Meyer was quiet and focused as always. Gottschalk, my adjutant, simply said we would do our duty and see what happened. He had survived enough battles to know that planning only went so far. Execution and luck determined outcomes. The night was warm. Despite being mid-September, men sat outside smoking and talking quietly. Some cleaned weapons repeatedly, though they were already clean. The activity provided comfort. Others wrote letters home, though mail collection was irregular and delivery uncertain. A few prayed alone or in small groups. Most simply waited. Time moved slowly before battle. Every man dealt with fear differently. The veterans were outwardly calm, having learned to control visible signs of stress. The replacements showed their nervousness more obviously through fidgeting and constant movement. Schütze Rainer approached me during the night and asked what battle was like. He was 17 and had never experienced combat. I told him he would learn soon enough. There was no way to explain combat to someone who had never experienced it. Words were inadequate. He would understand tomorrow, or he would be dead. Both outcomes would answer his question. At 0400 hours on the 13th of September, we received final orders. The battalion would advance, with 1st and 2nd companies forming the initial assault wave. They would advance in 2 parallel columns separated by approximately 100 meters. 3rd and 4th companies would follow 300 meters behind in support, ready to exploit breakthroughs or reinforce weak points. I would move with the forward command group immediately behind the assault companies, alongside Gottschalk and the communications section. The battalion aid station would follow with 3rd company. At 0430 hours, we moved to assembly positions at the base of Mamayev Kurgan. The movement took 20 minutes through rubble-choked streets. Buildings had collapsed across roadways, creating obstacles. We climbed over debris piles. Dust covered everything, making breathing difficult. Visibility was poor in pre-dawn darkness. We maintained strict noise discipline. Soviet positions were perhaps 500 meters ahead up the slope. They certainly had listening posts and patrols forward of their main defensive line. Any noise could alert them to our presence and invite preparatory fire. The artillery preparation began precisely at 0500 hours. 108 guns from divisional artillery fired simultaneously, creating a sound like continuous thunder. The noise was overwhelming even at our distance. Shells screamed overhead in continuous streams, creating a rushing wind sound. The explosions on Mamayev Kurgan echoed across the city and surrounding steppe. The hillside erupted in fire and smoke. High explosive shells tore into Soviet positions, destroying fortifications and killing defenders. Buildings collapsed. Trees were shredded into splinters. Fires started across the slopes. The barrage was systematic and methodical. Artillery targeted known Soviet positions sequentially. First the lower slopes, then intermediate positions, finally the summit. Mortars joined the barrage 5 minutes later. Heavy 81mm mortars fired from positions just behind us. The shells arced high and dropped almost vertically onto Soviet trenches. Mortar fire was particularly effective against troops in open positions or shallow trenches. The Soviet soldiers either took cover in bunkers or died in their trenches. We watched the barrage from our assembly positions. The explosions were hypnotic and terrifying simultaneously. We knew we would have to advance into that inferno in minutes. The smoke and dust would provide some concealment, but would also hide Soviet positions until we were almost on top of them. The artillery preparation lasted exactly 30 minutes. At 05:30 hours, it shifted to targets further up the hill. This was the signal to advance. The companies moved forward in extended lines across rubble-strewn ground. Visibility was poor through smoke and dust. Men stumbled over debris and shell craters. The noise was constant. Artillery continued firing overhead, targeting Soviet positions on the upper slopes. Soviet positions higher on the hill began returning fire as soon as they identified our assault. The first 100 meters were relatively unopposed. The Soviet defenders had taken cover during the barrage and were still recovering and repositioning. We crossed open ground, quickly moving through smoke and dust. Men maintained formation despite poor visibility and difficult terrain. Then, Soviet machine guns opened fire from positions we had not detected during reconnaissance or suppressed during the barrage. The sound was distinctive and terrifying. Soviet Maxim guns have a slower cyclic rate than German MG-34s. The sound is deeper, more methodical, thump, 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 rather than the high-pitched ripping sound of German weapons, but the effect is identical. Tracers streaked across the hillside, creating a lattice of death. Men fell immediately. Some died instantly, shot through the head or chest. Others screamed and writhed, wounded in the open. Still others fell silently and lay motionless, either dead or unconscious. First Company took the brunt of the initial fire. They were leading the assault on the left and were most exposed. Oberleutnant Dietrich had positioned his men well, but there was limited cover on the lower slopes. Men dropped behind rubble and into shell craters. The advance stalled completely within seconds. Men who tried to move forward were cut down. Those who remained in place were targeted by Soviet mortars that began falling among the pinned troops. Second Company had advanced slightly further before encountering resistance. Oberleutnant Koch had angled his company's approach to use a destroyed building as cover. This gave his men some protection, but also channeled them into a killing zone. Soviet defenders had clearly anticipated this approach. Machine gun fire raked the building ruins from multiple angles. Koch's men were trapped. Moving forward meant death. Staying in place invited mortar fire. Retreating violated orders and invited German military justice. Third and Fourth Companies were still 300 meters behind in their support positions. They could see the disaster unfolding ahead, but could not assist effectively without orders. Soviet artillery began targeting the assembly area where they waited. Shells exploded among the waiting men. Casualties mounted among troops who had not yet engaged the enemy. The frustration was palpable. I moved forward with Lieutenant Gottschalk to assess the situation personally. We advanced through smoke, using rubble for cover. Soviet snipers were active throughout the battlefield. Bullets cracked past constantly. Gottschalk was nearly hit twice. A round passed close enough that he felt the displacement of air. We reached Dietrich's position behind a collapsed wall after 10 minutes of careful movement. Dietrich was bleeding from a shrapnel wound to his left arm. He had bound it himself with a field dressing and continued commanding his company. His face was pale from blood loss, but his voice was steady. He estimated 20 men dead already from his company, perhaps 30 wounded. The remainder were scattered among various cover positions, unable to coordinate effectively. Every attempt to advance drew immediate fire from multiple positions. Coordinating movement was nearly impossible under such concentrated fire. I studied the Soviet positions through binoculars carefully. 3 machine gun nests were visible from my position. They were well positioned in mutually supporting positions. Each covered the approaches to the others. Attacking one drew fire from the others. They were using interlocking fields of fire exactly as doctrine prescribed. Professional work by competent defenders. I ordered mortars to target the machine gun positions with priority. The mortar crews were positioned 400 meters to our rear in a depression that provided some protection from counter-battery fire. They had been engaging targets throughout the assault, but without clear effect on the outcome. Now, I needed precision fire on specific positions. Gottschalk used the field telephone to relay coordinates to the mortar section. The mortar crews worked efficiently despite incoming fire. Soviet counter-battery fire was constant. Shells landed near the mortar positions, regularly forcing crews to take cover periodically. But they maintained discipline and continued firing. Within 5 minutes, high explosive shells were falling on the Soviet machine gun positions. I watched through binoculars as shells impacted. The first rounds were slightly off target, falling 10 meters to the left. I relayed corrections through Gottschalk. The next salvo was accurate. One machine gun position took a direct hit. The firing stopped immediately. The other 2 machine guns continued firing without interruption. Soviet mortars began targeting our position specifically. Someone had observed my use of binoculars and identified command personnel as targets. Shells began landing within meters of our position. Dietrich shouted a warning. We moved immediately, abandoning the position. The position we had occupied seconds before disappeared in an explosion. Debris rained down. A large piece of concrete landed where I'd been standing. We relocated to another position 20 meters away, behind a pile of rubble. Soviet fire followed us. They were competent and aggressive. Every movement drew attention. Every concentration of men drew fire. The Soviets had observation posts on the summit that could see everything on the lower slopes. Our artillery had not suppressed them effectively. They directed fire with devastating accuracy throughout the day. 3rd Company moved forward at my order to support 1st Company's attack. They advanced through the same killing ground that had stopped 1st Company minutes earlier. They suffered immediate casualties. Men fell in the first seconds of movement. Others reached cover and began engaging Soviet positions with rifle and machine gun fire. The additional firepower allowed 1st Company to begin moving again, slowly, meter by meter, using fire and movement in small groups. 4th Company supported 2nd Company's position. Together, they cleared the destroyed building and advanced beyond it into open ground. Soviet resistance remained fierce, but the increased German pressure began to tell. Machine gun positions that had seemed impregnable minutes before were overwhelmed by concentrated fire and grenade attacks. Soviet defenders withdrew to secondary positions further up the slope when their positions became untenable. The battalion spent the entire morning fighting for the lower slopes of Mamayev Kurgan. Every meter was contested violently. Soviet defenders fought from prepared positions that were difficult to identify until they opened fire. They withdrew only when positions became completely untenable from German fire or when they ran out of ammunition. Then they fell back to the next line of trenches and fought again with equal determination. We advanced slowly through a landscape transformed into nightmare. Shell craters overlapped, creating moonscape terrain. Buildings were reduced to rubble foundations. Trees were splintered stumps. Bodies lay everywhere. German and Soviet mixed together in death. Blood soaked into the dusty soil, creating dark stains. The smell was overwhelming and would only get worse. Explosive residue mixed with blood and human waste, creating a particular stench. Men voided bowels when they died, losing sphincter control. The dead leaked fluids as decomposition began quickly in the heat. The wounded screamed or moaned, depending on their injuries and level of consciousness. Medical personnel moved among them, trying to provide aid under fire. Many wounded lay untreated for hours. Some died waiting for evacuation that never came. Others were killed by artillery fire while lying wounded. By noon, we had advanced approximately 200 meters up the slope. 1st Company had been reduced to 42 men from 138 at the start. 2nd Company fared marginally better with 63 remaining from 142. 3rd and 4th Companies had moved forward to support the assault but suffered significant casualties in the process. 3rd Company lost 31 men. 4th Company lost 28. The battalion had lost over 170 men killed and wounded in 6 hours of fighting. We had gained perhaps 200 meters of destroyed hillside that held no intrinsic value except that orders demanded its capture. The fighting continued throughout the afternoon without pause. Soviet artillery targeted our positions constantly. We had no effective counter-battery fire. Our own artillery had moved forward but was still out of range of Soviet gun positions east of the Volga River. Soviet observation posts on the summit directed fire with devastating accuracy. Shells landed precisely on German concentrations. Any gathering of more than a few men drew immediate fire within minutes. The Soviet artillery was methodical and professional. They used a mixture of high explosive and shrapnel rounds. High explosive shells destroyed fortifications and killed men in the open. Shrapnel rounds burst above ground, scattering metal fragments across wide areas. Men caught in shrapnel bursts were shredded. The wounds were terrible to see, faces destroyed beyond recognition, limbs severed at joints, abdomens opened exposing internal organs. Medical personnel could do little for shrapnel victims beyond morphine administration and prayer. Casualties mounted continuously throughout the afternoon. Medical personnel were overwhelmed rapidly. The battalion had 4 medics, including the battalion medical officer. They worked without rest, moving between wounded men, tourniquets applied to severed limbs, pressure bandages on bleeding wounds, morphine injections for pain, triage decisions about who could be saved and who would be left to die. The decisions were necessary but brutal. Men pleaded for treatment. Some cursed the medics. Others accepted their fate silently. The wounded lay in shell craters and behind rubble waiting for evacuation that might never come. Stretcher bearers moved through the combat zone under fire, carrying wounded back to the aid station. Many stretcher bearers were killed or wounded themselves. The evacuation route back to the assembly area was targeted by Soviet artillery continuously. Casualties among medical personnel and stretcher bearers were disproportionately high. Several medics were killed during the first day. Replacements were drawn from infantry squads. Men with no medical training suddenly found themselves treating traumatic injuries using only basic first aid knowledge. One image from that afternoon remains vivid. A young soldier from 4th Company lay in a shell crater with both legs destroyed by shrapnel above the knee. The wounds were catastrophic, both legs severed or nearly so. He was conscious and screaming in agony. A medic reached him and administered morphine. The morphine took effect slowly over several minutes. The screaming diminished to moans, then to silence. The soldier died 10 minutes later from blood loss. The medic moved to the next casualty without pause. There was no time for emotion or reflection. The work continued relentlessly. Water became critical during the afternoon. Men had exhausted their canteens during the morning assault in the heat and stress. The heat was still oppressive, despite clouds of smoke and dust reducing sunlight. Dehydration affected everyone. Mouths became dry, tongues swelled, thinking became difficult. Men made mistakes they would not have made when properly hydrated. Some became delirious. Others simply stopped functioning effectively. Water resupply should have occurred during the afternoon, but the supply route was under constant fire. Water wagons could not reach forward positions safely. Men shared what little water remained. Some men hoarded their water and refused to share. Others shared freely. The difference revealed character under stress. I gave my water to a wounded soldier who was being evacuated. I would have opportunity to get more from the battalion supply. He might not survive long enough to need it again. Food was also unavailable. Men had carried emergency rations, but most had eaten them during the morning. Hunger combined with thirst and exhaustion to reduce combat effectiveness dramatically. By late afternoon, many men were barely functional. They followed orders mechanically but showed no initiative. The 1,000-yard stare was common. Eyes that focused on nothing, minds that had retreated inward to escape horror. Soviet resistance remained fierce throughout the afternoon, despite their own casualties, which must have been severe. Soviet dead lay throughout the captured positions. We counted over 80 bodies in the 200 meters we had taken. Actual Soviet casualties were certainly higher. Wounded had been evacuated during lulls in fighting. Others had withdrawn with the defenders to new positions. The Soviets were trading men for time. They knew reinforcements would arrive eventually. They had to hold until then. As evening approached, light began failing. The smoke and dust made visibility even worse than normal twilight. Fighting continued but became more confused. Friend and foe were difficult to distinguish in poor light. Several incidents of friendly fire occurred. German soldiers shot at other German soldiers in the confusion. Soviet soldiers infiltrated German positions in the darkness. Close quarters fighting erupted in several locations. We received orders at 1800 hours to consolidate positions and prepare for continued operations the following day. The order was a relief to exhausted men. Consolidating positions meant digging in and establishing defensive perimeters. It meant water and food resupply could reach us. It meant the wounded could be evacuated properly. It meant rest for a few hours before resuming the assault. The consolidation took several hours. Squads established positions in whatever cover was available, destroyed buildings, shell craters, improvised trenches scraped into rocky soil with entrenching tools. Fields of fire were established and cleared of debris where possible. Passwords were distributed for night security. Guard rosters were created. The work was done automatically. Veterans knew the routine from previous battles. Replacements learned by observing and following instructions. Water and food arrived after dark, carried forward by supply personnel who risked their lives moving through the combat zone. The resupply was inadequate, but better than nothing. Each man received 1 liter of water. It disappeared immediately. Men drank desperately. Some vomited from drinking too quickly on empty stomachs. Others drank slowly, savoring every drop. Food was cold soup in canteens and hard bread. The soup was thin and tasteless. The bread was stale. Men ate without complaint. Anything was better than nothing. Ammunition resupply was critical. Many soldiers had exhausted their basic load during the day's fighting. Machine guns had fired thousands of rounds. Rifle ammunition was depleted. Grenades were gone completely. The resupply wagons brought forward cases of ammunition under cover of darkness. Men redistributed ammunition to achieve proper load balance. Machine gunners received priority given their firepower importance. Riflemen took what remained. Casualty reports came in throughout the evening as companies tallied their losses. First company reported 61 dead and 49 wounded. Second company reported 42 dead and 53 wounded. Third company reported 34 dead and 41 wounded. Fourth company reported 32 dead and 46 wounded. Total casualties were 169 dead and 189 wounded. 358 casualties from 812 men. Over 44% casualties in one day. The battalion was severely degraded, but still considered combat capable according to doctrine. The night was relatively quiet compared to the day. Soviet forces conducted harassing fire, but no major attacks. Both sides used the darkness to resupply and reorganize. Wounded men moaned in no man's land between the lines. Some called for help in Russian, others called in German. Neither side could retrieve them safely in darkness. They lay suffering and dying. Some fell silent during the night as they died. Others continued calling at dawn. Their voices became weaker as dehydration and blood loss took effect. I did not sleep that night. Command responsibility prevented rest. I moved between company positions, checking defenses and speaking with officers and senior NCOs. Dietrich had his arm properly bandaged by the battalion surgeon, but refused evacuation. He said his company needed him. Koch was shaken but functional. Schmidt maintained his humor despite exhaustion. Meyer was quiet and withdrawn. Gottschalk remained at my side throughout the night, coordinating communications with regiment and managing the constant flow of reports and orders. Regiment sent new orders at 0300 hours. The assault would continue at dawn. Same objective, same plan, different day. Men received the news without comment. What could be said? Orders were orders. Disobedience meant court-martial and execution. Obedience meant probable death. The choice was between certain death now or possible death later. Men chose possible death and prepared to assault again. Dawn came too quickly on the 14th of September. Soviet forces had reinforced during the night. Fresh troops occupied positions we had fought to capture the previous day or positions immediately behind them. We discovered this when morning patrols came under heavy fire from trenches we thought were lightly held. The Soviets had used darkness to move reinforcements forward. They were determined to hold Mamayev Kurgan regardless of cost. The battalion attacked again at 0600 hours after a brief artillery preparation. The pattern was identical to the previous day. Initial advance across open ground, machine gun fire from concealed positions, men falling, others taking cover. Slow, methodical clearing of Soviet positions, casualties accumulating continuously. The fighting became more vicious as we advanced higher up the slope. Soviet defenders knew every meter of ground intimately. They had prepared fallback positions carefully. When one trench became untenable, they withdrew to another prepared position. German forces followed. Soviet artillery dropped shells on positions we had just captured, killing men who thought they had reached safety. Both sides fed men into the slaughter continuously. Progress on the 14th was slower than the 13th. Soviet resistance had stiffened with fresh troops and improved preparation. We advanced perhaps 150 meters at the cost of 112 casualties. The mathematics were terrible. We were trading men for meters of rubble. The exchange rate was unsustainable, but orders demanded continued assault. The 15th of September was worse than the previous 2 days combined. Soviet forces had been reinforced again during the night, with troops brought across the Volga on ferries and barges. Intelligence reported that elements of a fresh rifle division had crossed during darkness. These troops were experienced veterans, not the militia units we had faced initially. They were well equipped with ample ammunition and supplies. They counterattacked at 0500 hours before we could launch our own planned assault. The counterattack was fierce, well coordinated, and completely unexpected. Soviet infantry, supported by tanks, pushed down the slope, overrunning some of our forward positions in the darkness and confusion. The assault came from 3 directions simultaneously. First Company bore the brunt of the initial assault. They were positioned in the most forward positions closest to the summit. Soviet infantry appeared suddenly out of smoke and darkness. Dietrich rallied his men and held his position against overwhelming odds. He was killed by tank fire at 0540 hours. A 34mm gun fired at point-blank range. His death was instantaneous, which was mercy in war like this. First Company nearly ceased to exist during that counterattack. Men fought desperately with decreasing ammunition and increasing Soviet pressure. Some positions were overrun completely. The soldiers fighting there were killed or captured. Other positions held through superhuman effort and determination. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Braun took command after Dietrich died and somehow maintained cohesion. The company fought as a unit rather than dissolving into individual flight. Second Company was also heavily engaged. Soviet forces penetrated to within 50 meters of the battalion command post. I could see Soviet infantry moving through rubble toward our position. Gottschalk organized a hasty defense using headquarters personnel, signalers, and walking wounded. Men who had been wounded in previous days picked up rifles again and fought. Clerks became infantry. Radio operators became riflemen. Everyone who could hold a weapon fought. The defense was desperate and chaotic. Men fired at shadows and movement. Grenades were thrown blindly into smoke. At one point, Soviet infantry were within 20 meters of the command post. A group of 5 Soviet soldiers appeared suddenly through smoke. They were engaged immediately at point-blank range. All 5 were killed. 3 German soldiers died in that exchange, including one of our best radio operators. The fighting lasted 2 hours before Soviet momentum was exhausted. They had advanced approximately 100 meters down the slope, but could not sustain the attack. German artillery finally responded effectively, dropping shells on the Soviet assembly areas on the upper slopes. The Soviet attack faltered and then stopped. Soviet forces withdrew back up the slope to their prepared positions. We had held, but just barely. Casualties from the counterattack were severe. First Company lost 18 men killed and 23 wounded. Second Company lost 11 killed and 17 wounded. Third Company lost 7 killed and 9 wounded defending the flanks. Fourth Company lost 5 killed and 6 wounded. Total casualties were 41 killed and 55 wounded in 2 hours. 96 casualties defending against counterattack compared to the previous day's casualties attacking. By mid-morning on the 15th, we attempted to resume our own offensive operations per orders from regiment. The attack was launched at 0900 hours after reorganizing the shattered companies. The attack gained perhaps 50 meters before stalling against prepared Soviet defenses. The men were exhausted, ammunition was low, morale was declining visibly. Men moved forward because orders demanded it, but without conviction or aggression. The 16th of September began with another Soviet counterattack at dawn. They attacked with fresh troops again. The Soviets clearly had a continuous flow of reinforcements across the Volga, despite our artillery attempting to interdict the ferries. We had no such luxury. Our replacements came by truck over long, vulnerable supply lines. The Soviets had short supply lines across the river that they could maintain despite losses. This counterattack was stopped more quickly than the previous one. We were better prepared. Defensive positions had been improved overnight. Fields of fire were cleared. Ammunition had been redistributed. Machine guns were positioned optimally. The Soviet attack was met with concentrated fire that stopped it within the first 100 meters. Soviet casualties were heavy. We counted 63 Soviet dead in front of our positions after the attack ended. But our own casualties continued mounting. The 16th added another 23 killed and 39 wounded. The battalion bled continuously, whether attacking or defending. Soviet artillery never stopped. Soviet snipers were active constantly. Men died from artillery, from snipers, from mortars, from random bullets. Death was everywhere and unavoidable. Some men developed fatalistic attitudes. They assumed they would die eventually, so stopped trying to avoid it actively. Others became more cautious, perhaps excessively so. Different men responded differently to continuous trauma. By the evening of the 16th of September, the battalion was combat ineffective by any reasonable measure. First Company had 31 men remaining from 138 at the start. It was commanded by Unteroffizier Braun, who had been a squad leader 4 days earlier. Second Company had 43 men from 142. Third Company had 59 men from 124. Fourth Company had 51 men from 128. Total strength was 184 men from 812 men 4 days earlier. Casualty rate exceeded 77%. The 17th through 21st of September passed in continued fighting. Regiment committed reserve forces to continue the assault. Fresh companies from the 2nd and 3rd battalions of our regiment moved forward to replace our shattered companies. We provided guides and liaison personnel, but were no longer capable of offensive operations. The assault continued without pause, using fresh troops. Mamayev Kurgan consumed men like a furnace consuming fuel endlessly. Units were destroyed. Survivors were reorganized into provisional companies. The reorganized units were committed again. The cycle repeated with different men but identical outcomes. The summit of Mamayev Kurgan changed hands twice more during that week. German forces would fight to the top at enormous cost. Soviet forces would counterattack within hours and retake it. Neither side could hold the summit permanently. Both sides continued feeding men into the battle anyway. The hill became a symbol far beyond its tactical value. National prestige was invested in holding or capturing it. Both sides committed disproportionate resources to its possession. The cost exceeded any reasonable military calculation, but the fighting continued. I observed the continued fighting from our positions lower on the slope. Fresh German companies attacked up the hill. They advanced with determination and courage. They suffered the same casualties we had suffered. They gained the same meters of ground. They died in the same places. The hill consumed them as it had consumed us. The cycle was endless and horrifying. Soviet artillery continued targeting our positions despite our reduced combat capability. They did not know or care that we were no longer an effective fighting force. Any German positions drew fire. Men continued dying even when we were supposedly resting and reorganizing. 3 men were killed on the 17th by a random artillery shell. 5 men were wounded on the 18th. 2 men were killed by a sniper on the 19th. The casualties never stopped completely. Medical conditions among the survivors were terrible. Nearly every man had some injury or illness, minor wounds that could not be evacuated because they were not life-threatening, infected cuts, dysentery from drinking contaminated water, respiratory problems from smoke and dust inhalation, hearing damage from artillery, psychological trauma visible in 1,000 ways. The battalion was sick in body and spirit. Food remained inadequate throughout this period. Supply lines were tenuous and frequently cut. We received perhaps 1 meal daily, sometimes nothing. Men lost weight visibly. Faces became gaunt. Energy levels declined. Simple tasks became difficult. The physical deterioration paralleled the unit deterioration. Sleep was nearly impossible. Soviet artillery conducted harassing fire throughout the night. Random shells fell on our positions every 20 to 30 minutes. Real sleep was impossible under such conditions. Men dozed briefly, then woke to explosions. They existed in a state of continuous exhaustion that eroded effectiveness as surely as casualties eroded strength. Replacements arrived in small groups during this period. 10 men on the 18th, 15 men on the 19th, 20 men on the 20th. They were absorbed into the depleted companies. They received minimal orientation. Learn quickly or die quickly. Most died quickly. The replacements from the 18th were nearly all casualties by the 21st. They survived perhaps 3 days on average. The veterans who remained alive taught them what they could, but there was limited time and energy for training. On the 22nd of September, we received orders that we were finally being pulled off Mamayev Kurgan. The battalion was to withdraw to rear areas for reorganization and refitting. The order was received with relief so profound that some men wept. 9 days in continuous combat, 9 days of hell. It was ending. We would leave this cursed hill. We marched away from Mamayev Kurgan on the morning of the 23rd of September at 0600 hours. The march was only 5 kilometers, but felt longer. Men stumbled with exhaustion. Some could barely walk. We helped each other. The hill was still burning behind us. Smoke rose from hundreds of fires. Fighting continued without pause. Other units had taken our place. Other men were dying for the same destroyed ground we had fought for. The hill remained contested. Neither side held it decisively. Both sides had bled themselves white fighting for it. Nothing had been resolved except that hundreds of men were dead. The battalion was assigned to a ruined factory 5 kilometers west of Mamayev Kurgan for reorganization. The factory had produced machine tools before the war. Now it was rubble and twisted metal, like everything else in Stalingrad. We occupied the least damaged section, where some roof remained intact. It provided minimal shelter, but was better than open ground. The battalion assembled 203 men on the afternoon of the 23rd, including walking wounded and stragglers who had become separated during the fighting. Over 600 casualties in 9 days, 75% casualties. We were no longer a functional combat unit by any measure. We were a collection of traumatized survivors who happened to wear the same uniform. The men who assembled that afternoon looked like refugees, not soldiers. Uniforms were filthy and torn. Many men had lost equipment. Weapons were damaged. Morale was shattered. Some men sat motionless, staring at nothing. Others trembled continuously. A few laughed inappropriately at nothing. The psychological damage was as severe as the physical casualties. These men needed rest measured in weeks, not days. They would get perhaps 3 days before returning to combat. Medical examination revealed the true condition of the unit. Nearly every man had some injury or illness, untreated wounds, infections, dysentery, respiratory damage, hearing loss, malnutrition, despite adequate rations theoretically. The human body cannot function under such stress without breaking down. These men were breaking down systematically. The battalion surgeon examined every man personally over 2 days. He recommended evacuating 47 men for medical treatment. These were men with injuries or illnesses serious enough that they could not function in combat. Regiment approved evacuating only 23. The others were needed to maintain unit strength. Medical necessity was secondary to operational requirements. Men who should have been hospitalized remained with the unit. Lieutenant Gottschalk and I compiled detailed casualty reports on the 26th of September. The numbers were stark and terrible. The battalion had suffered 637 casualties in 13 days, including the march and 9 days of combat. 412 confirmed dead. 225 wounded. Of the wounded, 117 had been evacuated to rear area hospitals. 108 remained with the unit with various injuries. The dead included all 4 company commanders. Dietrich killed on the 15th, Koch killed on the 14th by artillery, Schmidt killed on the 16th by sniper, Meyer killed on the 13th during the initial assault, 17 other officers dead. 43 NCOs dead, 351 enlisted men dead. The leadership structure had been decapitated. The battalion existed in name only. I wrote letters to families of dead officers that afternoon, sitting in the ruins of the factory. The letters were difficult to write. What could I say? Your son died bravely for the fatherland? True, but insufficient. He died for a hill that we never secured? True but inappropriate. He died because orders demanded it regardless of cost? True but could not be written. I wrote the required phrases about duty and sacrifice, how their sons had fought courageously, how they had died honorably, how the fatherland would remember them. The words felt hollow even as I wrote them. These men died for nothing. The hill remained contested. Soviet forces still held parts of it. German forces held other parts. Neither side had won. Both sides had lost hundreds of men for stalemate. The truth was that these men died because military bureaucracy demanded continued assault regardless of tactical reality. The hill had symbolic value that exceeded its military value. Capturing it would demonstrate German superiority. Failing to capture it would demonstrate German weakness, so men died by the hundreds to avoid the appearance of weakness. This was the reality of war. Men died for symbols and abstractions. We received 280 replacements on the 25th of September. They arrived by truck from training depots in Germany. These men were fresh from basic training completed in Germany, far from the realities of the Eastern Front. They had no combat experience. They had never seen a dead body. They had never been under artillery fire. They had never killed anyone. They were about to learn all of these things rapidly. The replacements looked at us with something like horror when they first saw us. We must have looked like walking corpses, filthy beyond description, exhausted to the point of collapse, traumatized in ways visible to anyone. The replacements were clean and fresh, their uniforms were new, their equipment was complete. They looked like soldiers. We looked like something that had crawled out of a grave. I addressed the replacements that evening. I told them the truth, as much as regulations allowed. Combat in Stalingrad was unlike anything they had trained for. The fighting was brutal and continuous. Casualties were heavy. Many of them would die within days. The ones who survived would do so through combination of skill and luck. Skill could be taught. Luck could not. I told them to listen to the veterans who survived. Those men knew how to stay alive. The replacements looked frightened, which was appropriate. Fear kept men alert. Overconfidence killed. Integration of replacements took 2 days. They were distributed among the companies to fill gaps left by casualties. First company received 81 replacements, bringing strength to 112 men. Second company received 74 replacements, bringing strength to 117. Third company received 63 replacements, bringing strength to 122. Fourth company received 62 replacements, bringing strength to 113. The battalion was back to approximately 460 men. On paper, we were combat effective again. In reality, we were untested replacements led by traumatized survivors. Training was minimal. We had 2 days. The replacements learned basic things: how to move under fire, how to identify Soviet weapons by sound, how to take cover effectively, how to apply first aid. The training was rushed and incomplete, but it was better than nothing. Some of these men would survive long enough to learn more. Most would not. The veterans taught them what they could. Small things that made differences: how to pack equipment to reduce noise, how to dig a fighting position quickly, how to sleep in short intervals, how to eat quickly, how to recognize incoming artillery types by sound, how to spot snipers, how to clear rooms. The lessons were practical and brutal. This was not theory. This was survival. The division commander visited on the 27th of September. He was a general whose name I will not record. He congratulated us on our performance attacking Mamayev Kurgan. He said the assault had been successful despite heavy casualties. He said the hill would fall completely because of efforts like ours. He said the fatherland was proud of us. He said we would return to combat soon with fresh soldiers to finish the job. The men received this news silently. There was nothing to say to a general. Arguing was pointless. Contradicting him was insubordination. So we stood silently and accepted his praise and his orders. Inside, we knew the truth. The assault had not been successful. The hill had not fallen. More men would die for the same results. We were being sent back to die again with fresh meat to replace the previous casualties. After the general left, the men spoke more openly among themselves. The mood was dark. Some men expressed anger at the waste, others expressed resignation, a few expressed determination to survive regardless, most expressed nothing. They had learned that expressing feelings accomplished nothing. The army did not care about feelings. It cared about obedience and results. Feelings were irrelevant. Gottschalk and I discussed the situation privately that evening. We were both exhausted physically and spiritually. 9 days of combat had aged us. We had both seen terrible things. We had both made decisions that resulted in men dying. We carried that weight. He asked me if I thought we would survive the war. I told him honestly that I did not know. Survival seemed unlikely given casualty rates, but men did survive. Perhaps we would be among them. Perhaps not. The future was unknowable. We received orders on the 28th of September. The battalion would return to combat within 5 days. New operations were planned in other sectors of Stalingrad. The fighting for the city continued across multiple sectors. Mamayev Kurgan remained contested, but was no longer the only priority. The factory district to the north required attention. Other units would continue fighting for the hill. We would fight elsewhere. The location changed, but the reality remained identical. More combat, more casualties, more death. The battalion spent the next 3 days in final preparations. Equipment was repaired or replaced, ammunition was distributed, rations were stockpiled, men rested as much as possible, though real rest was impossible knowing what was coming. Some men wrote letters home, others prayed, most simply existed in a state of numb anticipation. On the 1st of October, we would return to combat. The battalion would enter new battles with new men. Most of those men would become casualties within weeks. The survivors would be reorganized and refitted with new replacements. The cycle would continue until the war ended or until everyone was dead. This was the reality we faced. This was what Stalingrad meant. Endless combat, endless casualties, endless replacement. Death on an industrial scale, consuming men as efficiently as factories consumed raw materials.